Hello, welcome back. This is Laura. I'm a science educator, and today I want to talk about types of stress. So, last time we talked, we defined stress as a challenge that we feel we're not capable of coping with, of surmounting. We perceive as if we don't have the resources to overcome it. All right. So there's normally an external factor that is triggering that stress, right? That we call the stressor. So this could be, and we were talking last week about the prey predator relationship, like mm, mouse being chased by a cat, a gazelle being chased by a lion. Um, that specifically, obviously, the predator would be the stressor for the prey. But the majority of humans are not chased by predators anymore. But for us, more common things that cause us stress are things like traffic or politics or uh, economics or bills piling up or work or the boss or, that type of thing. Any of those that causes us stress is a stressor. So there are ways of classifying um, stressors, and there are ways of classifying the stress that the stressors produces. So stressors specifically, we classify them in terms of the amount of control that we may or may not have over them. So if we have some degree of control over them, we call them a proximal stressor. Proximal because it's close to me, I may have some control over it. For example, if I'm stressed about a project deadline coming up soon, or I'm stressed about recurrently getting to work late, well, I can do things about that. I can shuffle around the things that I have to do in my day, set for another day things that are not urgent, and make time for the project that I need to work on to make sure that I hand it in before the deadline, right? If I've been getting late to work and I'm getting in trouble by being late, I can put my alarm clock half an hour earlier and see if that helps. There's things I can do that are that can potentially solve the problem, and that are within my control. On the contrary, if the stressor is something that, even though it stresses me, I have very little control over, then we call it a distal stressor. So, for example, um, the country's politics, the economy, the climate, the probability of a natural disaster happening. All of those are things that can stress me, but that I really have very little capabilities to effectively solve all by myself, right? You would say, well, but you could try to move to somewhere else where uh, politics are not so problematic, or where it's not so likely for tornadoes to go by, or whatever it is. And yes, that's a some level of control. But generally speaking, you would agree that putting my alarm clock half an hour earlier is a lot easier than moving, right? So all of these are ingredients, right? There is degrees of control and degrees of lack thereof, in every stressor that we can think of, but it's one way to look at them. Proximal if I have a good amount of control, distal if I don't have a good amount of control. So, in terms of the stress response to the stressor, one way of classifying the stress response is in terms of the duration of the stress. So, if the stress comes and goes quick, peaks, and then de-escalates, and I go back to baseline quickly, it is called an acute stressor. So, for example, um, and we're talking about lasting no more than a few hours. So, for example, when we were talking about a prey animal being chased by a predator, that can only last so long, right? Say the cat chasing the mouse, maybe a couple of hours. But after that, either the mouse or the cat or both are going to be exhausted. Something's got to give. Either the cat eats the mouse or the mouse escapes the cat, but it's not going to last forever. On the contrary, if the stress response lasts days, weeks, or more, we're talking about chronic stress, right? So, for example, caregivers of long-term illness or chronic illness patients tend to suffer chronic stress because we're talking about years. All right, and the interesting bit here is that chronic stress tends to be correlated to higher incidence of disease than acute stress. In fact, acute stress, and we'll talk more about that as this series of videos goes along, can be positive. All right, another way in which we can classify stress is depending on the type of response and how it lets us feeling. So, for example, the majority of times that we are commonly talking about stress, we are talking about this stress. This stress is the stress that makes me feel anxious or frightened, that produces negative results. However, not all stress is necessarily bad, and some stress can even produce positive results. So, for example, the classical example of good stress is sports or exercise, right? It is a stress in that is a challenge, and oftentimes I might feel like I don't have the resources to, I don't know, run on the treadmill for an hour. But and it produces psychological and physiological changes, but I'm left with a positive feeling. Even if my muscles are hurting, in general, we all feel better after exercising. But other things that can produce a positive type of result. I'm stressed because it's late and I have to go home, give my dog their dinner or my cat their food. And that maybe just makes me uh, close what I was doing, get in my car, and go home. And I finally get there. I'm happy to see my pet. I give them food. And at the end, I feel nice, right? It's a nice feeling that, yeah, I was stressed for a little bit, but I solved it, and I actually feel good that I got home and get my pet food. So when stress actually pushes us to resolve the situation and ends up making us feel good, we call it eustress. EU stress. Eustress meaning true stress, meaning good stress. All right. So in the context of the definitions that I've talked about, I don't know if you remember that last week I was talking about our evolutionary history as humans, as Homo sapiens. And it is my hypothesis, my guess, my educated guess, that for the majority of our evolutionary history, we humans have been exposed mostly to acute stress and proximal stress. Acute stress that might have been this stress because maybe we were chased by an animal or by another group of humans, but it couldn't have lasted days and weeks and months. It had to be solved somehow, kind of in the same way that the cat and the mouse situation had to be solved somehow. Or maybe eustress, like I'm hungry, I need to look for food, I'm cold, I need to look for a cave, but it promoted me to solve the situation, and it was something proximal in terms of I can go get food, I can go get a warm place to hide. However, modern life gives us a lot of sources of stress that are chronic and that are distal. And those types of stress are more correlated with disease. And my hypothesis is that our bodies, our physiology, our genetics, through millennia, have evolved to face stresses that are acute and proximal as opposed to, and only in very modern times are we subjected to stressors that are predominantly chronic and distal. And speaking of my hypothesis, my educated guess, I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you to take everything I say with a very inquisitive mind. Don't believe nothing, question everything. Um, Make sure that what we talk about here is food for thought, is the start of your journey in searching for information and looking and creating your own conclusions. Don't take anything that I say as the absolute truth, please. And then to wrap up this video, I wanted to leave you with a little homework. If you feel like it, you could make, it could be mentally, it could be written, a list of the things that are currently stressing you. And this currently, it could be right now, today, or it could be in this point in your life. And then look at that list with a view of the terminology that we talked about before. So you could think, well, is the stress that this particular thing that I listed here, does it cause me chronic stress or does it cause me acute stress? Does it cause me distress or eustress? Is the stressor that is producing me stress in this particular thing that I listed, is it proximal or distal, right? And then you can sit back and maybe try to focus a little bit more on the things that are proximal and that you have some control over. And maybe we could that way shorten the span that those stressors are causing us stress, which will benefit our health down the road because, as I mentioned before, generally speaking, uh, the longer the stress lasts, the least it starts to correlate with disease, right? Acute stress, on the other hand, like exercise, could even improve our health. All right. And if you want to share your list and your classification, you can comment here and I'll try to read as many comments as I can. And that brings us to the end of this one. So it was a pleasure to see you again. And I'm looking forward to see you next time to talk some more. All right. Bye now.